Good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Rader. This is the lecture for Intro to the Mass Media. It is our third unit in College Now Sociology. So let's get started. Okay, so what we're going to look at today is how we can utilize the three major perspectives of sociology: functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and conflict theory, to explain the roles of the media in shaping societal norms and values. So, to begin, one of the questions that I would pose if we were in class is to kind of think about your own understandings of the concept of bias. What does it mean to be biased, and how does that influence the ways in which we interpret information? So, one of my definitions of bias, and I think it's a really good way to think about it, is bias can really best be defined as really everything that we as individuals bring to the table in terms of our life experiences, including who we have interacted with, what we have read, what we've watched on television, what we've learned in school, what we've learned from our family and our friends and our coworkers, and everything that we've seen as part of our life education. In many ways, it colors our view of the world. It gives us deeper understanding of what we see. And as we engage in new experiences, we work on the previous existing schemas to really understand and fit it into our own concept of understanding. And one of the consequences of that is at times it can lead to problems. So, for instance, confirmation bias. If you see information that confirms your pre existing opinions, you're more likely to support it or believe it than if you see something that is new that goes against the grain, something that you don't necessarily believe in. So, what you see in front of you is a media bias chart, and what it does is it looks at all of the major news media organizations. And if you look at the y-axis, it looks at the overall quality. The x-axis looks at what's called the partisan bias. So, is it a article that leans liberal? Uh, Anything politically, like we're thinking more like Democrats, or is it leaning more to the right, like Republicans, conservative? If you look at the key, they explain exactly what the various colors are in this setup. So, for example, at the very top, it's original fact reporting. It's the highest overall quality. On the bottom are websites, television programs, news reports, and radio broadcasts that have inaccurate or fabricated information. So, for example, if we look at a couple of major sources that are out there now, the network news channels tend to be in the neutral category, minimal partisan bias, or there's a balance of biases. So, Bloomberg, Reuters, CBS, ABC, NBC, NPR, the BBC. If you look a little bit towards the left, we could see the New York Times, the Washington Post. If you look, it's kind of split down the middle. So, their news station tends to be more in the neutral, and their editorial page tends to skew a little liberal. Same is true if we look at organizations such as the Wall Street Journal or The Hill or even The Economist. As we get into the yellow really is beginning to indicate fair interpretations of the news. There's still some bias. There's complex analysis. There is some opinion and fair persuasion. And again, we can see sources on the left: Slate, Atlantic, Vox. On the right, the Washington Times, the American Conservative. When we get into the orange rectangle, this is unfair interpretations of the news. This is things like looking at the Huffington Post or the New York Post, Drudge Report. And then we get to the red, this is where we begin to see essentially information that's basically nonsense. And we see on the left, Patriot Biotics, the Palm Report, Occupy Democrats. On the right, InfoWars. If we look at the Breitbart News, the Conservative Tribune, Fox News kind of goes in between the orange and the red because they do have a news division that does give different interpretations of the news. Okay. So, in terms of thinking about some of the major perspectives, the functionalist view looks at the media as a way of socializing individuals from early childhood into old age. It enforces social norms, it confers status, and it promotes consumption. One of the earliest agents of socialization was a sociologist by the name of Robert Park. He studied how newspapers would help people coming into the country change their old habits and assimilate into the American experience, particularly in the cities. When we look at the functionalist view, it is an enforcer of social norms. It reaffirms the proper behaviors. It shows what happens to people who violate social expectations. So, for example, think of crime drama television shows, Law and Order, for example, as one that it can shine a light on potential deviant behavior. And it also promotes consumption. So this is a statistic from 10 years ago, but it's still pretty relevant today that the typical American child will watch 20,000 commercials a year. So we're being saturated with information day after day, week after week. Okay, so these are just some examples of how magazines confer status. So if we look at Time Magazine, People Magazine, Ebony, and Rolling Stone, there's each of these individuals kind of falls into a particular paradigm. This tends to be, for the most part, the exception on number 9, political figures. This really looks at celebrities. This one looks at musicians, so on and so forth. A conflict view. So whenever you think conflict theory, think Karl Marx, think the false consciousness idea. So under the conflict view, since so many of the big mass media organizations are owned by a very small elite core of individuals, the conflict theorists believe in an idea known as gatekeeping, which is the idea that the media is a big business in which the profits, bottom line, they're more important than the quality of programming. So, in terms of the access to information that people can actually learn about their world, it is produced through a filter. And that filter, in many ways, is what the audiences themselves want to see. Media monitoring. So this is something that you may have realized, you may not realize. So, for example, maybe you were looking up a new pair of shoes on Amazon, and then you log into your social media feed, and then you see in the corner an ad for the same pair of shoes that you were just looking at. This is an example of media monitoring. Conflict theorists would say that the companies are taking advantage of us. It's looking at this idea of targeted advertising. And then the other big problem with the conflict view in terms of the mass media, they believe that it really does construct a certain set of cultural beliefs and practices, and that it maintains the powerful social, economic, and political interests in the country, and it limits opportunities for many in the country. Okay, the feminist view. The 3 bullet points here pretty much get right at the heart of the issue, and on the next slide you're going to see some very clear statistics that back it up. But essentially, the feminist view is illustrating the fact that in many different types of programming, particularly sports programming, women tend to be underrepresented. They tend to be depicted as needing rescue by males, thus reinforcing the stereotype. So, for example, if you think about the Marvel movie franchise, if you've ever seen them, there's literally one movie, Captain Marvel, that really stars a major female lead. And then if you look at the DC comic universe, you have Wonder Woman. That's basically it. And that's just one of many, many examples. So this pie chart looks at network coverage of women versus men's sports. And again, the numbers are pretty glaring. 92% are sports coverage of men's sports. And test it out today. If you have access to ESPN, if you have access to MSG, the Yes Network, you can see when you log in, the vast majority of the programming, it's going to be men's sports being shown. Okay, so to kind of break it down into a very key distillation of the ideas, when we look at functionalism, remember there was the manifest function. This is the function that is very obvious. It's on the surface. There are latent functions. Organic solidarity. So think of the mass media as an organism. If it's going to function well, each of the individual moving parts need to be working together. And it does accept inequality, and that's one of the biggest criticisms of the mass media by the conflict theorists. So the conflict theorists look at this idea of the haves and the soon-to-haves. So it's this idea of the possibility of upward mobility, that individuals have an opportunity to move up in their social classes, but there are a lot of barriers that are in the way that make it very hard for them to actually move up. It rejects inequality, and it looks at every struggle through the lens of class and economics. The symbolic interactionists, these are, again, the individuals like Irving Goffman, George Herbert Mead. When we looked at the concept of the self, the meanings that we give to our symbols are culturally ascribed. So you may remember when we were in the classroom, we talked about different symbols that you would see on the road: hand gestures that people might give to one another, how it might mean one thing in one culture, but something completely different in another culture. And remember that there is this idea impression management. There's an interaction between the self and an audience. Okay, so when we think of the interactionist view, there's really two ways to kind of consider it. So think about if you've ever seen television programs where they want you to text a certain number to vote for your favorite person to move on. The most famous example of this would be the American Idol series. It's one of those American pastimes that really got people involved, audience participation in the actual broadcast. Other examples that can emerge from this, these are things like Super Bowl parties, the Academy Awards, so on and so forth. Okay, so in this image, it is a rendition of Superman, the Superman comics. And if you look at the time periods, the one on the left is looking at the Superman comics in the late 1950s. Title of the article, Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane, featuring baby Lois Lane. And as you can see, in this rendition of Superman, it's a very traditional male centric setup in terms of women trying to vie for the affection of Superman. By contrast, this is DC Comics from 2011, and you can see it's a very, very, very different representation of Lois Lane. Lois Lane and the Resistance, she really takes on the role as the main character. Okay, and in terms of just to recap everything, I want you to kind of walk away thinking about the purpose of the media, how the functionalists would view it, how conflict theorists would view it, and the symbols that we might see in the media. That'll help us to better understand the idea of how the three major perspectives, and others, we spoke specifically about the feminist perspective as well, how it can help us to better understand how the media functions within our larger society. Um, okay, everybody, I hope you have a nice day. Remember, the assignment is to simply write down two things that you learned, or one thing that you learned, and one question that remains, and to post a comment to one of your classmates' posts on the class discussion board. All right, so that's really what I want you to be able to do with this particular assignment. All right, everybody, have a good day, and we'll check back in tomorrow.